Healthy Neighborhoods seminar series. This is the second Wednesday of every month in this room, and we have a variety of topics that we present. If you'd be interested in being a presenter, or you have ideas on topics you'd like presented, I always welcome suggestions and ideas. We'd love to work with you on that. The upcoming presentations are on the flyer that went out. Our next speaker is Maureen Hack, who's a very prestigious and senior researcher here at Case Western Reserve University, and who will be sharing some of her information and research around adolescents and their health behaviors. The following session will be a special session where our peer fellows, and somebody will have to remind me what peer stands for, but they are research learners that are drawn from community organizations, paired up with a faculty member, an affiliated faculty from the Prevention Research Center for Healthy Neighborhoods, to do some focused training and then to conduct their own research project. And I believe it'll be a series of presentations. Mm-hmm. Is that correct, Terry? 5 presentations on a variety of topics. And we'll get that out to you soon about what those topics are for interest. But again, if you have ideas or presentations that you would like to hear, or you have data or ideas that you would like to present as part of this seminar series, I certainly would encourage you to contact me, and we can go from there. If you didn't sign in, we'd very much like you to do that. There's a sign-in sheet so that we can inform you about upcoming presentations, and also just so we know who you are and who's attending our talks. So I will introduce myself. I'm Sue Flockey. My primary appointment is in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. I have a secondary appointment in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And I currently serve as an associate director for the Prevention Research Center. My background, I'll get to that in just a little bit, but I really do want to acknowledge that the presentation that I'm going to do today is drawing on a couple of presentations that I've done, either in collaboration with some colleagues on this topic, in a variety of settings. It's also drawing on some materials that are available in books and in white papers that are available to you, and that I'll point to those resources at the very end. Let me just go ahead and move on with this and tell you a little bit more about what I want to accomplish today, and we have some variability in how we can move forward in this, and then just give you a little bit more background about me. So what I really would like to do is give you just a little more background, talk a little bit about qualitative methods and some orientations there, and then move the bulk of our conversation into mixed methods, both with approaches and designs, some of the challenges, and then provide a variety of examples. So before we move into examples, there's a lot of expertise in this room, and I'm curious about who's been engaged in using mixed methods in the past. So a handful of people. And then just broadly speaking, orientations towards data collection and doing research. And we'll just simplify and say quantitative versus qualitative, recognizing qualitative represents a wide variety of things. So how many folks would say they're predominantly trained in quantitative background, quantitative sciences? Okay. And how many would say that they're predominantly trained in qualitative or more qualitatively oriented? And then how many would say something other? You're coming from a different discipline that you wouldn't classify yourself as either kind of falling on the quantitative side or qualitative side. You're an equal opportunity researcher, maybe that would be mixed. So I don't want to oversimplify and just saying, you know, you're either quantitative or you're qualitative or you're mixed. There are other representations, and I think just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to use that lingo, and I hope that's not terribly offensive to anyone in the room. Okay, but that's helpful because the talk that I've done in the past and what I've prepared today is really oriented towards individuals who are predominantly focused on quantitative that would like to incorporate qualitative. It has a little bit more of that angle, but I think it also is helpful for folks who are predominantly qualitative to recognize some of the challenges that both quantitative folks have, qualitative, and how you come together as a team to make this happen. So a little bit more about me. My background is in psychology, organizational psychology, as well as health services research. So I am predominantly trained as a quantitative scientist. As I started my career, I had exposure to a couple of really remarkable landmark research studies that were mixed methods. Okay? They were combining together quantitative and qualitative. And that really influenced me and shaped some of the questions that I began to ask. And the main project that I started off on, and I wrote and was fortunate enough to get funded as a KO7, a Career Development Award recipient, was predominantly qualitative. So here I am as a very junior person, right out of my quantitative training, proposing to do a qualitative study. I don't recommend that. Kind of the learning by doing is a very challenging approach. But I want to share that with you because that sort of provides the grounding for the recommendations that I'm going to make. So this, kind of the take-home message here is that mixed methods is becoming popular. You're seeing more of it. It seems to make a lot of sense. However, it is challenging. Just thinking that you're going to go off and do this is not really easy, and I'll get to some points about why that is. But I do want to acknowledge that there are others in the room, and I hope that we can get to some questions and comments and sharing, and that this will lead to a good discussion of some strategies about what others have learned and what might get applied. Okay, moving on. So I do want to spend just a little bit of time orienting around qualitative methods, and I apologize for lumping. And what I do want to acknowledge is that qualitative methods represent a wide range of traditions, okay? And that these traditions have methods, they have specific orientations towards philosophy with regard to what can be known, what should be known, what is reality. These different world views differ, and there are disciplines that are aligned with some of these traditions. So for example, ethnography has very specific methods that traditionally go with it, that have different evaluations with regard to the rigor that's required for good quality ethnography. The purpose of it is a cultural description, and we might think about that in certain kinds of contexts, but it can get used in a variety of kinds of contexts. And the allied discipline that's most associated with that would be anthropology. Okay? But I want to share that there are many, many different traditions that we're lumping underneath this term qualitative research. Coming from a perspective predominantly quantitative, we are typically thinking about what are the decisions that drive a study. It's the study design and then the specific methods. The philosophical and theoretic perspective is often in the background when we're coming at this from a quantitative perspective. It is very different when we're thinking about these other traditions of qualitative research. That tends to be much more in the foreground, and it really does drive how you even think about who you're going to study and how you're going to study it. Okay. This is a comparison between quantitative and qualitative features, and highlights again some of the differences in orientation. And where we're headed with this is there are some strengths to both of these kinds of approaches, but there are also places where the orientation is just different, okay, which creates some conflict or some clashing. So thinking about the role of the researcher from a quantitative perspective, we are detached, we are objective, we are scientists, right? Okay, and I could just feel the hair on everybody's back as a qualitative researcher go up and say, no, that's not the way it is. Whereas with the role of the qualitative researcher is engaged. You are not detached. You are deeply engaged because the methods require that you are deeply engaged with the people who are participating in your study. When it comes down to a purpose, the purpose of quantitative is typically to test a hypothesis. Okay? You want to know, does this intervention affect the outcome that we're after? Does it work? Whereas the primary purpose of qualitative research, again, globally lumping here, is to describe, to generate a narrative, and to develop theory. Data collection methods, with quantitative, it tends to be you specify what your methods are a priori. So before the fact, before you start anything, this is a quality of rigor. You must specify what your hypothesis is, how you're going to collect your sample, who you're going to study, how many you're going to study, and what your analysis plan is. All that happens before you start your study. It is different with qualitative approaches. With qualitative approaches, you start out with a plan, a strategy. How many interviews do you need to do? It depends. It depends on how informative the people are that you're interviewing. Who are you going to interview? It depends. I know where I would like to start. I know what I would like to achieve. How many? I don't know. And I won't know until I get there. Okay? You see where that's a little bit at odds in terms of approach and orientation towards rigor. So it would be highly criticized if you said, I'm going to do in-depth interviews and I'm going to do 12. 12. Sounds like a good number. 12. Well, 12 might not be enough. What would be a marker of rigor is you have a starting point, a rationale for who you're going to study, and your approach or your strategy for how you're going to know how many are enough. Okay, so that's why it's flexible, it's iterative, and that what you learn during the data collection process informs where you go next. Okay? Data analysis, deductive and statistical, versus an inductive, iterative, evolving approach with regard to the qualitative. Data types are generally different. Qualitative could include quantitative counts, numbers, data collection, surveys. It could include those kinds of things. They tend to be word-oriented, interview-oriented narratives. Very rich, thick descriptions. The products at the end of the study, at the end of a quantitative study, you get an answer. Did the intervention work? No, it did not. I can say emphatically, no, it did not, with this probability. Okay? That's your product. Or yes, it did work. It worked great. And it worked super great for this subgroup. Okay? With a qualitative analysis, you end up with a very rich narrative, a story, a deep understanding of some culture, a phenomena, an event, and meaning of that event. You might end up with a biography. You might end up with a book. You might end up with the development of a new theory. Okay? Very different end products. Very different orientations towards what is valuable and what it means to conduct science. Okay? So, given that background and that context, what does it mean to then come towards mixed methods? The general idea is that there is some value and importance that could be drawn from using both of these methods in concert. Okay? And this is particularly relevant for issues in public health where we're looking at questions and concerns, research projects that are embedded within social, political, and economic contexts. Okay? You've got this level of complexity. So what we propose is that there's something to be drawn from both quantitative and qualitative methods in answering fairly complex questions. And I really like this this quote from Brewer and Hunter saying, attack the research problem with an arsenal of methods that have non-overlapping weaknesses in addition to complementary strengths. Okay, so it's not an either or, it's a here's my research question, what is the best method or methods to answer that research question? And so mixed methods are particularly relevant for areas where the questions are complex, okay, or it's in a complex setting. Okay. Any questions or comments, reflections right now?
Can you just give an example of non-overlapping weaknesses, kind of what you're thinking of in that regard?
Well, so I think that going at the strengths and then the sampling of where you might draw the most insight from the different methods. If one strategy is particularly weak or has a blind side to it, so let's say we're interested in conducting a survey. If we're unclear about how to really articulate the questions, it might make sense to first do some very in-depth interviews, elicit the right language, the right way of framing these questions to then create those questions. So harkening back to my psychometric training, my first exposure to these notions of mixing methods was this classic article that came out by Campbell and Fisk of this idea of multiple operations. So they were really interested in measuring things. How do you know you've measured something? This idea of validity. And one of the propositions that they put forward is that you might have multiple things, multiple constructs, multiple things that you want to measure, and that we should try to measure them in different ways, using different methods. And so this multi-trait, multi-method matrix was just an idea to get at that there are alternative ways to try to measure things, and doing it in that approach could greatly inform the rigor with which you're measuring what you think you're measuring, which is what we call validity. But there have been many, many others who have begun to propose using mixed methods. This has been around for a while, and I think I would point back to medical anthropology as probably one of the traditions that, or one of the disciplines that has a long, long history of using mixed methods. But mixed methods points to really purposefully using both qualitative and quantitative methods to address a research question. It's purposely designed to draw on the strengths of both methods. And I think this is where the discipline is really moving, true integration of those data. It's particularly useful for applications where like the example I gave, where you have a very hard to measure construct, something where you don't quite, you know there's a phenomena there, but you don't quite know how to get at it, using a survey or using an approach like that, where the phenomena that you're after are very complex. There are a lot of moving parts. Phenomena that involve multiple players or interactions, where understanding from the multiple perspectives might require different methods and different strategies. And another application is informing processes during an intervention study, and I'll bring this example up again. So if you think about the column that was on quantitative, and the outcome is the outcome of the intervention. Did it work? You know, answering your hypothesis, and the answer is yes, or the answer is no. Informing the process during an intervention study about some of the characteristics, what was going on, what were some of the processes, could enlighten or inform even more that final answer of did it work. Well, it did here and it didn't there, and here are some of the potential explanations about why. So typical mixed methods applications, just some examples. Surveys and focus groups data could be merged and compared. You might do a survey first and then in-depth interviews to further explain what's going on or to get a deeper narrative, a deeper understanding. You might use focus groups first to understand a concept, and then develop a survey, and then administer that survey in a random sample of individuals. This is probably one of the most important things to think about. If you're new to mixed methods, you might be thinking about your own single study that you'd like to do, and I want to do a survey, and it might be nice to do some interviews to explain or understand a little bit more deeply. That would be mixing within a study, okay? And I do think that that's fairly common. But I want you to think about opportunities for mixing methods within a line of inquiry. So it doesn't have to happen within a single study. There is value to mixing methods within an entire line of inquiry, and I'm going to share a really great example of how that's been done by one of our colleagues, Kurt Stange, and hopefully he'll weigh in on some of these findings too. So within a line of inquiry, you could think about it in terms of within your own area or within your own discipline, that it's not even your line of inquiry, that in order to inform and move forward understanding and science within, let's say, food access, that having researchers engage in a breadth of methods, attacking that problem with an arsenal of all kinds of methods, okay, that you're gonna, is that too militaristic? Attack. You know, but a broad topic area might benefit from a variety of methods, just like it benefits from a variety of investigators. Okay, these multiple different lenses to get at a phenomena to really more fully understand it. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about study designs. We're going to talk a little bit about sampling. And then we're going to move into some examples. And I'll share a couple of examples, and then maybe we can open it up because you guys might have some comments, reflections, suggestions, some things from your own experience. So I'll move through this, and then maybe we can talk about some of these things a little bit. So like any, you know, I keep saying that this is emerging. It's been around for a good, I don't know, 20 years, I would say. The language mixed methods and being explicit of this integration of qualitative and quantitative. It may have been around a bit longer than that. However, with any new emergent thing like this, there is language, jargon that goes with this. We don't have long traditions of how we name it. And I'm going to try to avoid a lot of that jargon in conversations that go back and forth. This is largely drawn from work by John Creswell, who has several textbooks, as well as a best practice that was supported by the Office OBSSR, Office of Behavioral Science, Social Science Research. Thank you. And I have that. I'll make these slides available to you and want to highlight those resources as good ones to turn to if you'd like to read further. But 4 basic kinds of study designs: sequential, concurrent, embedded, and multi-phase. So sequential would be a study first and then another study. So it could be a quantitative study followed then by a qualitative study. So conduct a quantitative study. There are findings, interpretations that then would inform and direct a qualitative study. Okay? You could have qualitative first and collect data, inform, make interpretation that then sets up quantitative study. Okay? Sequential. And we've already talked about this kind of an example. It could be concurrent. Okay? You could have 2 studies going on at the same time that come together, generate results, interpretation, and you would present that. Okay? And that would be an example or a concurrent study. And I'll share an example that we actually have in the field right now of a concurrent study. The third type of study design is an embedded study. So you have a study that is predominantly quantitative, and within that study design, there is some qualitative data collection, or vice versa. Okay? But you have something that is a dominant study design and type, of which you layer on a smaller element that has additional alternative methods and sampling that comes together to the results, the interpretation, and then presentation. Okay, so I think the emphasis, where I'm talking about these pieces is that they're not 2 separate studies. It's not just a convenience thing that you're using a vehicle, a larger study to add on some pieces, but that truly a mixed method is integrating and interpreting and presenting data from both. I also presented this example of starting off with a quantitative study, embedding a qualitative study, mostly to inform an intervention. Okay, that I think is really, really helpful and very useful because, thinking about just the answer to your hypothesis without more informative, rich story or narrative about why or what happened or to guide what might come next, regardless of what the outcome of the intervention is, right, would be really, really helpful. Okay. The last type of study design is the multi-phase, and this gets at a line of inquiry, and it's not just sequential, but it goes beyond that. So you might start off with a quantitative study that then might lead to a qualitative study that might lead to an embedded study. Okay, but it is a line of inquiry, a multi-phased.
So can you clarify? Do you know what those are before you start?
No.
Okay. Just wondering if it was something that had to be laid out as you did it. Okay. I didn't really hear that you can't do that, but
So I guess this one is not so different than a sequential,
okay.
right? When you start off, I mean, you might have a sense that that's going to happen, but I think that this, so I kind of hesitate to even call this. They call it Creswell calls it a study design. It's not a singular study design, right? Kurt?
So Sue gave the right answer to the question. The only exception is when you give a job talk. Then you give a lie. You just planned it all out as a process. But job
in
talks,
a grant writing.
right? But job talks are great. Right? Yeah, they're all lies. It's a lie. But Sue gave a good answer.
This is not a job talk, by the way. Just for clarification. but I will keep that in mind. Okay, so study designs, and again, this is, there are lots of, I spared you the labels there are a lot of labels out there. My sense is keep it simple, be able to explain it, and if you do use a label from the, go back and cite that original one, but most people aren't going to know the specific label. So explain it, and that's why I actually like these particular labels, the sequential, the concurrent, embedded, because they actually are sort of intuitive and can explain. Some of the labels get complex.
So I have a question in terms of, it arises because of the embedded nature of these. If you do an embedded qualitative analysis in the conduct of an intervention study, for example, and this, maybe you're going to cover this later, but is there the possibility that qualitative study may affect the intervention in some way by allowing people to kind of spill their guts about what's going on, or does it? Are there concerns that sometimes embedding can actually affect the outcome? I guess is what I'm asking.
I think that's a possibility, and I think you would want to work that into your design. And just jumping ahead, when thinking about any of these designs, this is one of the challenges. You really need to uphold the rigor for all of it. Okay, so your quantitative study design has specific elements of evaluating the rigor of that science and that design. The qualitative has its own piece. There needs to be some compromises in order to accomplish it most of the time, or at least considerations, decision points. But that certainly would be one of them. If we want to know this process information, how do we do that in such a way that it doesn't unduly influence the effect you're looking to study with your quantitative study? Okay. The other main thing I want to talk about is sampling, because I think when I was doing the comparison between the quantitative and qualitative approaches, sampling seemed to be the piece that was most conflictual. So I'll just preface this by saying there are multiple sampling decisions to be made, and that you typically, in a mixed method study, you typically end up with multiple samples, or multiple analytic samples, perhaps is the way to say it. So it's not always one sample. So the basic sampling strategy for quantitative studies typically is something around probability sampling. And here are just some examples. So it could be a random sample, it could be a stratified sample, it could be a cluster-oriented sample. The main kinds of sampling for qualitative studies, again, sorry for the gross generalizations, would be purposive sampling. Okay, you're sampling not from a random perspective, but with purpose of maximizing understanding for your qualitative question. Okay, so it may be that you're sampling to identify special or unique cases. You might be interested in the outliers most. You may do sequential kinds of sampling, like a snowball sampling kind of strategy, where you start off with one key informant and you ask that key informant for other people that you ought to talk to better inform what you're after. Okay, so it's a sequential kinds of sampling. You may be interested in doing sampling to achieve representativeness. Okay, so that is a reasonable way to do sampling within qualitative studies. But it again is very much driven by what is your research question and who are the right people to engage, or peoples, or organizations, or levels to engage to answer your research question. If Convenient sampling I have listed here. It happens. It is, I don't know, we should put like an X in front of it. It is not the desirable strategy for either quantitative or qualitative. And let's see if I have it on the bottom. And sorry, you can't really, maybe you can read it better up here. There is a very nice article focused specifically on mixed method sampling by Ted Lee and Yu. And I'm happy to get the specifics of that reference to those who are interested. When it comes to mixed methods, here are some of the decision points. One, and this is true of any kind of research you're doing, the research questions need to drive the sampling. Okay? So if you have a component that's quantitative, a component that's qualitative, and a component that's mixed, or some combination of those, the questions need to drive how you go about your sampling. Okay? And I would just put that as foremost. The challenge with some of this is there are not a whole lot of rules of thumb to go to and say, okay, we're doing a randomized clinical trial, I know how to do that, and here's the ideal. Okay? I would say that the sampling is easier for sequential study designs, and that is because you have your first study, it's going to have its own sample. You may choose to do a subsample in your next study, or not, but they essentially are sequential studies with different samples. If you're doing an embedded sample, or an embedded study design, how you define who that sample is. So here, your example of how do you conduct those interviews to ensure that you're not influencing the intervention or the outcomes that you're looking to study in your quantitative study, becomes a little bit more complex. So it might be that you have a large sample and that you're looking at a subset, or you're looking at specific actors within that organization. What the sample size is, when you actually do the sampling, and how you do the sampling is complex. Okay? There are no easy answers. It really depends on your research question and the design that you have laid out in front of you. And again, there are not good, it seems like every study is different. You might find a study that's in the literature that is similar to what it is that you want to do and look at some of how they did it, and there might be some things that you'd like to emulate in that. But you're not going to get an answer of this is how you should do it. It really depends on your context and your study questions. Okay. That's it, what I wanted to share on sampling. And I'm sorry if that feels somewhat dissatisfactory that I don't have the answer. But I think that that's the main point, that it is complex. And there are some considerations in how you would go about it. Okay, so I wanted to move on to a couple of examples, and mostly just share these as just what I've had exposure to in the past, or current studies that we have going on, is just examples of mixed methods. A lot of the stuff that I do happens to be in the primary care context, so that's where these examples come from. So I just want to share a couple of these with you, and then maybe open it up for other comments, questions, examples that people want to share. And if you'd like, we can move on to a couple of other things. I have a couple of summary slides and just a couple of other points that I want to make. So let me move through these quickly. Right now, we have a special interest project, a SIP, as part of the Prevention Research Center. And we are collecting data to understand medical residents in primary care, so that's family medicine, internal medicine, and OBGYN. The CDC is interested in knowing how well these residents are prepared to do obesity counseling, nutrition counseling, physical activity counseling, with an orientation towards cancer prevention. This is a concurrent study design. So we're interested in assessing from the residents' knowledge, attitudes, their current practice, and we're also interested in assessing the components of their training program, how that training is conducted, the breadth of that, what the variability is, and if that has an influence, what features are associated with greater knowledge, stronger attitudes towards doing counseling, and their practice. So on the left-hand side, we have our quantitative pieces. I'm interested in this resident survey, getting knowledge, attitudes, current practices, and some demographic pieces. Qualitative side involves key informant interviews. We specified who we wanted to talk to, or at least who we thought the key informants would be, and then we're also using a little bit of a snowballing effect strategy. Talking with the program director, talking with chief residents, talking with anybody who's involved in doing training around counseling. So if they have a behavioral scientist, we're talking with them to understand philosophy, to understand their curriculum. Because, so why did we have to do this qualitative piece? The kinds of things that we're after about the program are not documented in a meaningful way anywhere. Okay, so we can't ask a single one person to provide that information. It's not in logs, it's not documented across programs systematically. So it's really required us to use a qualitative approach. And the reviewers of this grant bought that. They're like, yeah, you're right. So we're using a concurrent design, collecting both those data simultaneously, 2 different samples. Okay? Sample for the qualitative study include program director, associate program director, chief residents, and anybody else that they direct us to. The sample of residents include, there's a little bit of overlap, it will include the chief residents, but it includes all of the senior residents that are a part of the training program. And that will be coming together. So one of the things that I didn't really talk about very much is the program features that are identified here in our qualitative interviews. We're going to do some quantification of that. We're going to create variables, okay, quantified variables that I have over on the left, quantitative now, quantified program features that will get included in the analysis. So I'll have a narrative and some descriptives around what this program looks like across 28 programs, scope, variety, philosophies, etc. But I also have some quantitative data around that. It'll come together to inform our research questions. Okay. This is an example line of inquiry. Kurt Staney was the PI on the vast majority of these projects, and some of this stuff he and I had put together for a presentation to the National Cancer Institute that was sponsoring a conference on mixed methods. So I have to acknowledge that some of these come from that. But so this is an example line of inquiry. On your left are observational studies. On the right are intervention studies. And there's pinging back and forth of informing. But the first one I want to share with you was the direct observation of primary care study. Really interested in using a variety of methods to get at the delivery of preventive services. Okay, so we could skip this long text one. But what I want to share with you were the different strategies to get at this information. So what's in this list are the different strategies of data collection. This study was predominantly quantitative. However, what I've highlighted at the bottom, there were ethnographic field notes, and lots of them, that were collected during this time that these research nurses were in these practices collecting the data.